Hi. Okay, so we are going to work on the introduction to soil systems. And in this video, I'm just going to be covering how to draw a systems diagram of soil, what are all the components, the storages and inputs, outputs, and so on. And you're going to need to be able to actually draw this diagram. So whether you kind of draw it along with me while I'm going over it, or if you watch it and then kind of want to look at the diagram in the end and hit pause and kind of go through and copy it, that's okay too. But do realize that you need to understand what all of the things are that you're labeling too. So I'm not asking you to annotate it, but do be aware you need to be able to talk about what those different pieces are. Okay, so in the systems diagram, we're going to do storages, right? So this is the list of the storages you need. The inputs, things that are going into the soil. These are kind of the flows, and the outputs. So what's going in, what's coming out. And then the transfers, so moving things around back and forth. And then finally the transformations. And so the transformations are when you actually have some sort of chemical change within that soil. All right, so let's take a look. All right, here's our soil. And let me move my head over here. Here's our soil. And here's the different storages, so the things that actually make up soil. We have that inorganic material, mineral particles, rocks, things like that. We have organic material. That could be living organisms, or it could be, actually there's organisms in there too, but organic material is going to be any of the possible kind of detritus and things that were made by living organisms. Nutrients. So these are things like nitrates and phosphates, things that are important for plants to be able to uptake. There are air spaces in soil. So soil is not, there's little air pockets in between a lot of those different particles. And of course, there's also water. We're going to learn later about the different kind of types of soil. There's clay soil, sandy, loamy soil. And a lot of those different textures of soil will allow for more or less air and water and nutrients and all that kind of stuff. So we'll take a look at those in a bit more detail in our next lesson. All right, so now the transfers. These are the things that are moving within the soil, but it's not actually changing its chemical or physical properties. It's just moving around. And essentially, we can have both leaching, biological mixing, and infiltration. So infiltration is just when water is moving through the soil. So usually due to gravity, it's probably moving down. So it's water in the soil is moving down due to gravity. But leaching is when you have nutrients and inorganic material that's moving with the water because they're soluble in nature. So, salts and other things like that can dissolve in the water, they can be moved down, and that could be nutrients as well through leaching in the soil. And you'll see kind of what that can look like in the resulting layers of soil, because some of the nutrients tend to pile up in places and less so in other parts. Biological mixing. This is just the movement of all of the parts of it, because you've got roots that are growing in and moving things around. You have earthworms that are crawling around in the soil. So there's a lot of mixing of all these different things because there's organisms that live within the soil, whether it's a mole or a vole or a worm, or even the plants and their roots that are starting to move. So the parts of it start to mix around. And that's going to be really an important process in keeping soil health. Okay, so these are our transfers. Now, the next part is transformations. So the transformations are when you have some sort of chemical or major physical change in the material. So one big change that can happen is organisms can die. And of course, if they die, become this detritus, and then they decompose. And we know the decomposers, like fungi and bacteria, they are going to and the detritivores, they're going to decompose that material and turn that into nutrients. And those nutrients can then be taken up by plants or other things. So it's breaking down that organic detritus after organisms die and decomposing that, or fallen leaves or whatever that may be, into the nutrients that can then be used by plants. And of course, we have nutrient cycling. You've already learned about the nitrogen cycle. We've talked a little bit about the phosphorus cycle. So these nutrients that are important for plants to take up, like nitrates and phosphates, there's a whole cycle often happening with bacteria and other organisms within the soil. And that is just changing from, ammonia to nitrate, and nitrate can then, can denitrify. So there's all these different processes and the bacteria that go along with it that are cycling all of these nutrients within the soil. And weathering. So weathering is when you have, rocks and other things that get broken down into smaller parts. And weathering can be both chemical weathering, physical weathering. Like the roots can come down and start to break apart rocks and other things. Some of these, nutrients and other things that have leached within the soil can help chemically weather it, make it into smaller pieces. So this weathering is going to change the composition. Okay. And of course, with all that biological mixing going on, that's how it can kind of move around and not just be in one spot. Okay, so now inputs. Inputs are what goes into the soil to help form it. It's kind of one of the flows. And so leaf litter is one nice input of organic material. Okay, so you might have organisms that are in the soil that die and create the organic material, but you can also have that leaf litter that starts to break down and become part of the soil as well. And there's also the inorganic matter from the parent material that's coming up, and that is part of what goes into the soil as well. And of course, water. So water will come into the soil with precipitation, and then eventually you'll see it infiltrates. I don't know why there. It will infiltrate further. So the input here is the precipitation, and the infiltration is once it's actually in the soil and it's moving down. All right, and then the outputs. The outputs are erosion of the soil. So soil can be washed away by water or wind. We'll learn later on how important it is to make sure that if you have a farming system and don't want to lose your soil, there's a lot of techniques you can do to help keep the soil from eroding away. So it can leave the system by moving with water or wind. Evaporation. So water will evaporate out into the atmosphere. And then, of course, plants will uptake water and nutrients and turn that into their living bodies, which then eventually will turn into leaf litter and can go back in. So there's a bit of a cycle there. But if you're farming and you take the plants away, then actually those outputs then don't get put back into the soil. All right. So, so essentially, this is our system. This is what you're going to need to be able to draw. All right. And just to kind of show you a couple examples of what happens sometimes with this evaporation, other things, you can see on evaporation, if evaporation is greater than precipitation, the soil can actually become salty because of all these minerals that have been absorbed into the water. Instead of leaching downward, if they're evaporating outward, the minerals stay in the soil and the water evaporates away. And so with this evaporation of water, if there's any minerals in it, those stay in the soil, and then you get this really salty soil. So that can cause salinization or salination. And that's an important aspect, that if you're trying to farm in a really arid area, you have to be careful, because a lot of the minerals that might be in the soil, if you're doing irrigation and other things, might get left behind as the water evaporates, and then you have soil that really can't maintain crops. Okay, so in the next video, we'll talk about soil formation.